Chapter 1. The Crisis of 1943. October 14, 1943. The Americans called it Black Thursday, and for good reason. 320 B-17 Flying Fortresses set out from England that morning, their target a ball-bearing factory deep inside Germany at Schweinfurt. The crews knew what was coming. They'd done this before back in August, and it had cost them dearly. But the orders were clear: daylight precision bombing would win the war. That's what the generals believed. The bomber formations droned eastward across the channel, tight and disciplined. For the first 100 miles, P-47. Thunderbolts stayed with them, providing what cover they could. But then, right at the German border, the escorts had to turn back. They were out of fuel. The bombers continued alone into the heart of the Reich. That's when the Luftwaffe struck. They came from every direction. Messerschmitt 109's Focke-Wulf, 190's twin-engine destroyers armed with rockets. Wave after wave, they tore into the bomber formations. The German pilots knew exactly what to do. Wait until the escorts leave, then attack. It was a strategy that worked with brutal efficiency. By the time the surviving bombers limped back to England that evening, 60 were gone. 60. That's 600 men dead, wounded, or prisoners. Another 17 bombers were so damaged they'd never fly again. The loss rate was staggering, unsustainable. 1 in every 5 aircraft that left that morning didn't come home. In the officers' clubs that night, nobody spoke much. The math was simple and terrifying. At this rate, bomber crews had almost no chance of surviving their required 25 missions. 57% would be dead or missing before they completed their tour. Something had to change. The problem was range. The P-47 Thunderbolts were magnificent fighters, tough and heavily armed, but they couldn't go the distance. Even with external drop tanks, they ran out of fuel before reaching targets deep in Germany. The P-38 Lightnings had better range in theory, but the drop tanks they needed weren't available yet, and the aircraft itself was in short supply. Everything was going to North Africa. General Hap Arnold, commanding the U.S. Army Air Forces, put it bluntly to his staff: unless they could find a way to protect the bombers all the way to their targets and back, the entire strategic bombing campaign would fail. And if that happened, the planned invasion of France, Operation Overlord, scheduled for June 1944, might not be possible at all. The Luftwaffe was winning, and everyone knew it. Chapter 2. The Marriage of Airframe and Engine. But while American bomber crews were dying over Germany, something remarkable was happening in the skies over southern England. The North American P-51 Mustang had been around since 1940, originally designed for the British Royal Air Force. It was a beautiful aircraft, sleek, fast, with clean lines and excellent handling. Pilots loved flying it at low altitudes where it performed superbly. But there was a problem. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang's Allison engine gasped for air. Power dropped off dramatically. In the high-altitude battles over Europe, where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs thrived, the early Mustangs simply couldn't compete. Then came one of those chance meetings that changes history. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang. He was impressed with everything except the engine. After landing, Harker had an idea that seemed almost too obvious. What if they took out that struggling Allison and replaced it with a Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the Spitfire? The Merlin wasn't just any engine. It was a masterpiece of British engineering, featuring a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that delivered enormous power at high altitude. The same basic design had kept Spitfires and Hurricanes competitive throughout the Battle of Britain. But here's what made it revolutionary in the Mustang. The American airframe was more aerodynamically efficient than the Spitfire, with a unique laminar flow wing that reduced drag, and it could carry far more fuel. The marriage of British engine and American airframe created something unprecedented. By October 1942, the first Merlin-powered Mustang took to the air. The results were spectacular. Speed jumped from 390 miles per hour to over 440. The ceiling pushed past 40,000 feet, but the real magic was in the range. With internal fuel and external drop tanks, this aircraft could fly for over 6 hours. That meant a combat radius of 750 miles, maybe more. 750 miles. From England to Berlin and back. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could not only reach the deepest targets in Germany, but also had the performance to take on the Luftwaffe's best at any altitude. The Packard Motor Company, already producing Merlins under license in America, could manufacture the engines in massive quantities. By August 1943, the U.S. Army Air Force had ordered 2,200 of the new P-51Bs. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock, an American air attaché in London and veteran fighter pilot, had been championing the Merlin-Mustang combination since the fall of 1942. He'd seen what it could do and predicted it would be the best fighter of 1943. Now, as the first operational P-51Bs began arriving in England in November 1943, his vision was about to be tested in the crucible of combat. The 354th Fighter Group received the first aircraft. They were officially assigned to the 9th Air Force, but the 8th Air Force, desperate for long-range escorts, immediately borrowed them. On December 1, 1943, the Mustangs flew their first combat mission, a fighter sweep over France. 5 days later, they escorted bombers to Amiens, then Emden, then Kiel. The crews were getting familiar with their new mounts, but everyone knew the real test was coming. Berlin. Chapter 3. The First Mission to Big B. March 4th, 1944, 4 in the morning. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Group dragged themselves from their bunks, awakened by the distant thunder of B-17 engines starting up across the airfield. It was too cold for shaving. They dressed quickly and stumbled to breakfast, then to the briefing room. When they saw the map, they understood why they'd been roused so early. A long red ribbon stretched from their base in southern England across the North Sea, over Holland and northern Germany, straight to a large letter, B. Berlin. They were going all the way to Hitler's capital. The plan was intricate. P-47. Thunderbolts would escort the bombers on the first leg, staying with them until their fuel ran low. Then they'd peel off and the Mustangs would arrive, taking over protection for the bombing run itself and the journey home. Other P-47 and P-38 groups would provide coverage on the return leg. The 4th Fighter Group had just received their P-51Bs 4 days earlier. Some pilots had less than an hour's experience in the aircraft, but there was no time for extended training. The bombers needed them. They took off in the pre-dawn darkness and formed up over England. 48 Mustangs arranged in tight formation. The squadron leader circled until everyone was in position, then turned east toward Germany. They climbed steadily. At 20,000 feet, they crossed the Dutch coast. Below them, the landscape was already marked by war-crashed aircraft bomb craters visible in the pale morning light. As they flew deeper into German airspace, they saw it. Smoke trails in the sky, black puffs of flak, burning aircraft tumbling earthward. The bomber stream had been under attack for some time. The P-47 escorts were still there fighting off Luftwaffe interceptors, but now it was time for them to turn back. Their fuel was running low. The Mustangs pushed forward. One pilot later described the moment they joined the bombers over Hanover. The sky was full of contrails, aircraft circling and diving, tracer rounds arcing through the air like deadly fireworks. The Luftwaffe hadn't expected American fighters this deep in Germany. They'd been focused on the bombers making their attack runs. Now, suddenly, there were Mustangs everywhere. The German pilots faced a terrible choice. Their mission was to destroy bombers, not dogfight with escorts. But these American fighters were in their way, and they couldn't just ignore them. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs broke off their bomber attacks and engaged. The Mustangs were faster. They could turn tighter at high speed. And they had one thing the Luftwaffe pilots didn't have enough fuel to stay in the fight. The sky over Berlin was thick with smoke from the anti-aircraft guns below. The bombers made their runs, dropping their loads on the German capital, while the Mustangs circled above, fending off wave after wave of interceptors. It was chaos aircraft, spinning parachutes blossoming the constant rattle of machine gun fire over the radio. Then it was done. The bombers turned for home, and the Mustangs formed up around them for the long flight back. The Luftwaffe continued to attack, but their numbers were thinning. The Germans were low on fuel now, too. One by one, they broke off and headed for their bases. As the formation crossed back into Holland, P-47s and P-38s arrived to take over escort duties for the final leg. The Mustang's fuel running low after 7 hours in the air descended toward England. They'd lost aircraft. Combat was never without cost, but they'd done it. They'd escorted heavy bombers to Berlin and brought most of them home. On March 6th, they did it again. This time, the squadron shot down 20 Luftwaffe fighters without losing a single Mustang. The Germans were learning that the rules had changed. Berlin was no longer out of reach. Chapter 4. The jig is up. Hermann Göring stood at the window of his estate, Karin Hall staring out at the gray March sky. He'd built a career on swagger and promises. "No enemy bomber will ever reach the Reich," he'd famously boasted. "If they do, you can call me Meyer." Well, they'd been bombing Berlin for months now, and nobody was calling him Meyer. But they also hadn't been protected by fighters. Not until now. The reports from March 4th were unambiguous. American single-engine fighters had appeared over Berlin. They'd escorted the bombers all the way in and all the way out. The Luftwaffe pilots were stunned. They'd thought such a thing was impossible. Göring later admitted in interrogations after the war that seeing Mustangs over Berlin convinced him the war was lost. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin," he said, "I knew the jig was up." It wasn't just rhetoric. The appearance of long-range American escorts represented a complete strategic failure. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive doctrine had been built around the assumption that Allied fighters couldn't reach deep into Germany. Now that assumption was shattered. But Göring's realization came too late, and for all his power in the Nazi hierarchy, he couldn't change what was already in motion. Between January and June 1944, the 5 months before D-Day, the Luftwaffe was systematically destroyed. More than 2,200 German fighter pilots died during that period. In May alone, a quarter of Germany's total fighter pilot force perished. These weren't just numbers on a page. These were experienced aviators, the men who'd learned to fly in peacetime, who'd fought in Poland, France, and over Britain. They were irreplaceable. The losses in March were particularly devastating. 56% of available German fighters were shot down or destroyed on the ground. The Americans had changed their tactics. Instead of staying close to the bombers, the Mustangs were now ranging ahead, sweeping German airfields, catching fighters on the ground, or as they were taking off. Lieutenant General James Doolittle, who'd taken command of the 8th Air Force in January, had given his fighter groups a simple directive: destroy the Luftwaffe wherever you find it. The Germans tried everything. They pulled pilots from the Eastern Front, but those men trained to fight slower. Soviet aircraft were cut down quickly by the Americans. I don't remember anyone who came to us from the East who survived. One Luftwaffe commander later recalled, "They threw inexperienced youngsters into combat with minimal training. Boys barely old enough to shave, flying against veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. The results were predictable and tragic." By April, the Luftwaffe's defensive system was collapsing under the weight of unsustainable losses. The Americans weren't just winning air battles, they were destroying the German fighter force faster than it could be rebuilt. Aircraft production continued, but there was no time to properly train the pilots to fly them. Fuel was becoming scarce. The whole system was breaking down. When April 29th rolled around and the bombers came back to Berlin, poor bomber formation discipline led to heavy losses. 55 B-17s and B-24s went down that day. But the Luftwaffe paid for it too. Their losses in pilots continued to mount, and unlike the Americans who could draw on a massive training pipeline back home, the Germans had no replacements. Chapter 5. D-Day and Air Supremacy. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. While Allied soldiers struggled ashore under German fire overhead, a different battle was playing out, or rather, wasn't playing out. Where was the Luftwaffe? On D-Day itself, Allied air forces flew 14,674 sorties over Normandy. The Germans managed 319. The ratio was almost 50-1. German fighters had been stripped from France and Belgium pulled back to defend the Reich itself. There was nothing left to oppose the invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, wrote to his wife, "The enemy's air superiority has a very grave effect on our movements. There's simply no answer to it." In his diary, his naval liaison officer noted bleakly that modern warfare had changed. The Allies were turning the flank not from the side, but from above. The months of aerial combat over Germany had achieved their objective. By the time Allied soldiers hit the beaches, the Luftwaffe had ceased to be an effective fighting force. They had aircraft, plenty of aircraft actually. German factories dispersed across the Reich after the bombing campaign were still producing fighters, but they didn't have fuel to fly them properly. They didn't have experienced pilots to man them, and they didn't have the training infrastructure to build a new generation of aviators. The Mustangs had broken them. During the Normandy campaign in June alone, the Luftwaffe lost 931 aircraft in combat. By the end of the month, only 425 fighters remained operational in France. Allied air superiority was so complete that German ground forces couldn't move during daylight without being attacked. Supply columns were strafed, tank concentrations were bombed, Any vehicle that moved on a road was a target. One German pilot who'd transferred from the Russian front described what it was like. His unit arrived in Normandy with 15 pilots. Within the first month, 8 were dead, including their squadron leader. They flew constantly. First takeoffs at 5 a.m., last landings at 10 p.m., always outnumbered, always fighting desperately. "We were hopelessly inferior to the English and Americans," he recalled. The P-51 Mustangs that had first escorted bombers to Berlin in March were now ranging freely across France, destroying German aircraft wherever they found them. Some Mustangs were fitted with rockets and extra cannons for ground attack. They hit trains, airfields, truck convoys, anything that supported the German war effort. The cost to Allied aircrew was still substantial. Nearly 17,000 Allied airmen were killed, wounded, or captured during the Normandy campaign. But those losses, while tragic, were sustainable. The Americans and British could replace their losses. The Germans could not. Chapter 6. The Beginning of the End. By autumn 1944, the war in the air was effectively over. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper. They even managed a few desperate counterattacks like Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, 1945, when they threw everything they had at Allied airfields in the Netherlands and Belgium. They damaged some aircraft on the ground, but the operation cost them hundreds of experienced pilots they couldn't afford to lose. It was the last gasp of a dying force. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, they had about 3,000 frontline combat aircraft remaining. But they had no fuel to fly them, no trained pilots to man them, and no infrastructure to support operations. The mighty Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in 1940 existed only as a ghost. The P-51 Mustang didn't win World War II by itself. That would be absurd to claim. Millions of soldiers, sailors, and airmen contributed to victory. But the Mustang solved a critical problem at a critical moment. It gave Allied bombers the protection they needed to strike deep into German territory. It destroyed the Luftwaffe's fighter force. It achieved air superiority, which made D-Day possible. The first operational Mustang flew in 1942 with an Allison engine that couldn't perform at high altitude. 2 years later, fitted with a Merlin engine and drop tanks, it was escorting bombers to Berlin and systematically dismantling German air power. The transformation was complete. The impact was decisive. General James Doolittle, who commanded the 8th Air Force during the critical period, said it best years later. It is generally conceded that the air war against Germany was won during the phase of our operations between the beginning of February 1944 and D-Day. That was the period when Mustangs ruled the skies. When those first P-51s appeared over Berlin in March 1944, they carried more than bombs and bullets. They carried a message that the German High Command understood immediately. The Reich's skies were no longer their own. The defensive strategy had failed. Distance would no longer protect them. Hermann Göring knew it. The Luftwaffe pilots knew it. And deep down in places they didn't want to acknowledge, the German leadership knew it too. The war wasn't over yet. There would be more fighting, more dying, more destruction before it ended. But on that cold March morning when the Mustangs reached Berlin, something fundamental shifted. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The Silver Fighters, with their distinctive profile and long range, had changed everything. They'd turned the tide. They'd won the air war. And in doing so, they'd helped win the war itself.